To today's webinar, Avoiding the Pitfalls of Business Process Improvement. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Diana Davis, editor of TextNetwork.com. Now, organizations spend a lot of time, money, and effort in a bid to improve their business processes. But if a few key issues aren't considered right from the start, these efforts can sometimes be met with less than desirable results. So here to share with us some of what those critical issues are is Brian Schramke. Brian is Senior Technical Consultant, Operational Excellence Practice for Kepner Trigo, and he's here to answer any questions you may have. Brian, I'll pass the presentation over to you.
Good morning, and thanks, Diana. Appreciate you all joining us this morning. As Diana mentioned, the presentation today is really kind of drawing on the last 20 or so years of my personal experience and 50 years of my organization's experience working with organizations to improve their business processes. And I think you'd be hard-pressed to find a company that hasn't at least attempted or completed one of these journeys or more in the last several years. The presentation is hoping to communicate a few things, and certainly I'm open for questions at the end of it all. But what are those critical success factors that make journeys for BPI either successful or less than successful? What are some of the pitfalls? I'll present a really high-level model for how most organizations approach business process improvement and talk about the different things that can go wrong and things to look for in each of those phases. But probably most importantly is what can you do to avoid those pitfalls? So hopefully be able to communicate some practical advice for when you recognize these kinds of pitfalls. What can you do to either mitigate them or help avoid them? So in most organizations that have approached business process improvement, they typically end up using an approach that looks something like this, and they may call the different phases different things. This is the model that we happen to use. But essentially out of strategy being informing us as to what the right business process to focus on as a core capability to enable that strategy, identifying the process that people want to improve. Secondly, structuring how you're going to go about affecting that change and creating those improvements. The third step typically is to take a look at the process that you're using today and figure out where the opportunities to improve it are. The fourth step being to design the improvements to that, whether it's in changing the boxes and arrows of the process, in improving the tools that enable the execution of that process, or in implementing things that allow us to better manage the process. The fifth piece then is how am I going to measure this new process that I'm going to implement? The sixth stage being the planning of that implementation and what work is required to change from what I have today to what I desire to be tomorrow. The seventh box there is the future process implemented, so actually doing all the work that's required. And then the eighth bucket being the management of that process as an ongoing how I run my business on a day-to-day basis. So sort of using that as the framework for talking about the different things that we've seen organizations do well or not so well, that's the framework that I'm going to use throughout the remainder of the presentation. So if we look at the first bucket, which is process identified in scope. So you've hopefully got an organizational strategy. That strategy has said the kind of company you want to be, the kind of driving forces that are going to make your company successful against the competitors, the products and services you're going to offer. Another piece of most organizations' strategy is saying, if I'm going to be this kind of a company, I have to be good at this kind of a business process. And really that ought to be driving what processes you focus your BPI efforts on. When we see organizations kind of struggling with that question, some of the things we see them kind of stumble sometimes around are things such as they don't understand the magnitude of the effort that they're undertaking. They either expect too much from too little effort, or they expect a lot of return without understanding all of the effort that goes into it. Another thing that they often do is they pick the easy or the simple ones. There's a process and it only has a couple people that work in it, so it ought to be easy to make a change. Or there's some processes where there's some low-hanging fruit, but they also don't understand whether or not that contributes to the strategic value they're trying to obtain. And the last pitfall that we often see is sometimes they choose what is obvious to them as the business process they ought to focus on, again, without understanding whether or not that's going to provide the strategic value they're expecting it to. So as you're making these choices very early in the process, there's a lot of due consideration that needs to be given to a couple things. And when we see organizations that struggle with these kinds of pitfalls, here's some things that we've helped them to do. The first is you've got to make these decisions consciously and rationally, and you've got to tie them back to strategic objectives. So if you are expecting if you're expecting to improve customer service by only affecting a small change at something that doesn't matter to the customers, you've got to understand what it is that you're attempting to do and whether or not the effort you're about to undertake is capable of producing that results. And a lot of times, all that is just a matter of having conversations. We use things like if you're a Lean Six Sigma type organization, a SIPOC, a supplier input, process output, customer format, to get people to talk about what is the actual process, what are we considering to be in scope, what are we considering to be out of scope, what are the inputs that this process has to handle, what are the outputs and the expectations of our customers. Having those conversations avoids a lot of heartbreak later on. A lot of times you'll see organizations not having those conversations, then having a lot of conflict when they get down to actually changing things because they hadn't reached agreement early on. Another thing that we ask them to do is keep the ultimate internal and external customers in mind, and don't assume that you know what they are. I had a project a few years back with a company that manufactured furniture, and what they were essentially doing was converting their order to cash to decrease the cycle time from a 6-week lead time down to a 6-day lead time, and they expected that to produce a lot of strategic value. About halfway through the project, they started recognizing how much work was associated with that and got a little bit nervous as to whether or not the customers were going to see the value. And at the end of the day, when we went out and we actually flew around the country and talked to a number of different customers in a number of different segments, only a portion of those customers in some of those segments said that was a good thing. Others just said, we don't care how long it takes for you to make it, just get it here when you promised. So having those conversations, making sure you know what your customers are looking for as you select, because you're undertaking a large effort here. So take an effort that is going to produce some results that are valuable strategically to the organization is sort of the lessons learned out of that. Once I've selected the process that I'm going to focus my efforts on, there's more to it than just putting a few people in a room for a day and now magically becomes a new process that everybody likes. So there's some structuring of the work required before you start recruiting resources and putting this effort in. And some of the things we see organizations struggle with there is not securing the strategic process or the issue, if it's an issue-based effort, getting that owner's alignment and involvement. There's a lot of times you see organizations do something to somebody's process without the process owner being on board and saying, yes, I need this help, and yes, I see value in this improvement. It may be odd for a consultant to talk about the next bullet point, but don't leave the work to us. Leaving the planning and the work to external consultants or internal business process improvement groups is not necessarily going to provide the results that you're looking for. There's a time and a place for them, but certainly leaving it to them is not usually a best course. Don't ignore or silence the critics. There's a lot of people who probably recognize opportunities for improvement and may be viewed as complainers in the organization. Don't ignore what they've got to say. They're the ones who live with the process, and there's again a time and a place to involve them and engage them in the process. And lastly, don't view the BPI effort as simply a series of a couple of meetings or as some committee who's going to go off and come out with some solution. There's more to it than that. So again, when we see organizations kind of coming up against these pitfalls, some of the things that we ask them to do are make sure that people understand and agree as to why the BPI project is necessary. Again, there's a lot to be said. These are the folks who are going to have to execute the process once it's been approved. These are the people who have a lot of information as to why it may be performing the way it's performing today. You really need those folks on board, and I can't overemphasize the value of making sure you've got them on board from the beginning rather than doing something to them. That's not exactly a recipe for sustainability. There is a time and a place to use external consultants and internal business BI groups, but the leadership has to come from within. So external consultants or BI groups can bring methodologies, they can bring tools to the table, They can do some of the legwork that's required as part of the project. But certainly it's your business process, and you've got to have the voice that says, here's how I want it to perform, here's where I see the weaknesses, here's what I'm willing to invest. Leaving that to a third party is not going to produce the results most often that you're looking for. The fact of the matter is, as painful as it may be, the complainers are usually the ones who have the good ideas as to how to fix the problems. It's very rare that you have somebody who complains but doesn't have an idea as to how something might be made better, if only they were given the sort of the keys to the kingdom. So engage those people in the process. If you've got a complainer and can turn them around, usually that's the key to good successful implementation, is getting the people who thought it couldn't be fixed to be the leaders and saying, here's how we're going to fix it. And last but not least, the BPI initiative is a lot of hard work. It's not just a couple of meetings. There's grunt work, for lack of a better term, that has to be done in between those meetings, and the meetings really are more around making the decisions that are going to frame the work moving forward. They're to gain consensus around what's been done, but certainly the meetings aren't where the work happens. The work happens in between the meetings, where people are getting together and discussing exactly what they're going to do. So at the end of the day, put together a project plan, estimate the resources, understand the objectives of the project, make sure you've got a schedule that works with people, and make sure that you put some good thinking around the definition and the plan of how you're going to get to the end state that you're looking for. The next bucket is really looking at the current processes and either documenting them if they're not documented, if they're not documented, and then analyzing where the gaps are. And where we see folks struggle in this area of the BPI engagement is they think that looking at the same old reports is going to give them enough information to understand what they need to understand in order to design improvements. A lot of times people say, well, we don't need to look at the current process because we've got a procedure manual, and the procedure manual tells you what the process is. And people kind of get duped into believing that what the procedure manual says is actually what's happening, and quite often it's not. And the last thing that we see folks struggle with is they often think that the current state analysis is nothing more than a repeat of the ISO process, or rewriting the procedure manuals, as opposed to looking for new information or information that's not today understood that will help them understand where those gaps are. So when you're looking at your current process, a couple of things you can do to not fall into those traps is, first of all, the summary information that you probably look at every day, every week, every month, and the existing reporting. A lot of times that kind of masks micro causes. So if the analysis of the current state is a search for the root cause of poor process performance, it's not very often that people see that root cause type information that leads them in the right direction in the information they're already looking at. You've got to stop asking the same old questions, and oftentimes you need to gather new information, whether it's new to the level of detail, whether it's new because it's in different areas that you really haven't looked at before. A lot of times what we'll do in a current state analysis is put in place some temporary, some interim controls to ask and answer questions that aren't being asked and answered today, to see if that tells us something. Also, documentation doesn't equal execution. It's a great starting point to start with an SOP or to start with a process flow, but until you actually get down to where the work is being performed and observe it yourself, you really don't know for sure exactly how the work is being performed and where the issues and the problems are occurring. On the opposite end, this is not an ISO level effort to document the current processes. Getting it perfect really doesn't add that much value. What we're really in search of here is finding out where the gaps in the process are to a reasonable level of certainty versus a statistical level of significance. So it's not about getting to the nth degree. It's about getting enough information that I'm comfortable making decisions about how to fix it without necessarily having definitive black and white answers to every question that I might want to ask. So balancing the amount of effort required to get information versus the value that you'll receive once you receive it is really the name of the game here. Once I've got a good understanding of the current state process and where the gaps are, Obviously, the next step then is to design that future process. And a couple of things that we see folks do here. One is we change the org structure. We buy an ERP package or a software package. We roll out Six Sigma or Lean, assuming that that is going to affect the change that we're looking for. And while those are all valuable and sometimes good things to do, they're typically not the starting point. Another thing that we see is people fall in love with the sexiness of a complex solution. And the more complex it is, obviously, the more value it's going to bring to the organization. And unfortunately, sometimes just basic blocking and tackling is really the solution to the problem that you're trying to solve. And last but not least, there's a lot of best practices that are out there in your industries, in your markets, in your competitors. Thinking that a best practice is a one-size-fits-all and we can just plop it in place and it works in sort of a turnkey fashion is a bit of a fallacy in our experience. It may be a good creative thing to get you start thinking about how you might solve it, but it's not something that can be just put into place lock, stock, and barrel and produce results in most cases. So again, when we're looking at trying to avoid some of those pitfalls, the software organization change, training and developing capabilities, putting in place continuous improvement programs are all good things, but really it's got to start with the business process. How do you want the work to be executed, knowing that all of those things may enable or make less difficult doing what those sort of boxes and arrows of the process are calling for. The number of times we see organizations who call us up and say, you know, we've just decided to change the org structure. Can you make sure our processes work? It's really kind of backwards in our experience. Is you've got to start with what do I want the process to look like, and then how can I take all these other things and make sure they enable the process as I've designed it to be. Complexity doesn't always equal better. There's a lot of pride, and this is, to be quite honest, where CI groups and external consultants tend to like this play is in the complex solutions. And if there is a complex solution, it doesn't have to be a binary turnover, so they can be reached in stages. So can I do something knowing that automation or some complex solution or some holistic solution across multiple sites is the end goal? Can I get there in stages, and can I do it in sort of a pilot fashion, or can I do something manually first to make sure the mechanics are correct and then enable it with software? Understanding how you want to get to where you want to be is not necessarily I turn it off on Friday and on Monday everything works this way. And last but not least, best practices in reality are only the best practice for the organization that was able to implement it. Every organization is unique. Every organization has things that can't be quantified in a best practice model, such as the culture, the way people work. So assuming that I can just take something that somebody else has done and make that exact same thing work for me is going to cause you a lot of heartache in most cases. There's a lot of work and there's a lot of thinking that needs to be put into taking the concepts of a best practice and making it a best practice for your organization that a lot of folks don't necessarily recognize. The next stage, obviously, if you're going to have a process and you want to manage it and you want it to work well over time, you're going to have some way of getting some indication as to whether or not that's happening. So thinking now about the process measures and how I'm going to be informed as to whether or not the process that I've designed and implemented and put in place is working. Now's the time to think about what that dashboard sort of wants to look like. Don't assume, and a lot of organizations do, that the existing performance measurements are going to tell me whether or not it's working. Oftentimes, you're going to need to modify your existing performance measurement systems to capture and report and give you information about new and different things that you're doing. We see a lot of organizations relying on lagging indicators being at the end of the process, how did it do? As opposed to when I'm managing a process, the more leading indicators I can get, the better off I am, so that I can catch performance as it starts to degrade versus waiting for the end of it and finding out how poorly or how well it performed. And last but not least, again, sort of on the opposite end of the spectrum, a lot of organizations tend to overmeasure at this point in time. Just because you can measure something doesn't necessarily mean that it is good to measure something. So avoiding the overmeasurement and the jet airplane dashboard for a tricycle is the key here. So some of the things we do to try and avoid these things is, if you think about the new process that you're putting in place and you're thinking about how to measure it, it really helps to sit there and say, you know, what are the new things that I should see people doing? What are the new activities? What are the new standards to which those activities are going to be measured? And how can I put in place some things that give me good information about whether or not those things are being accomplished? And quite often when you're designing a new process, the things that you're measuring today need to either be supplemented, changed, removed, because they no longer tell you something, but thinking about what it's going to look like in the future and putting in place the measures that will help you in the future manage that process is key. The leading indicators, again, if you're willing to wait until the end of whatever your reporting cycle is to find out how you did, that's one way to do it, I suppose. But really the leading indicators, even if you put in temporary leading indicators as the process is being implemented, to make sure you can catch as quickly as possible and as upstream as possible when that performance is going south. And you can start to think about how can I coach and possibly change or debug the process to make sure that the lagging indicator that I'm going to capture at the end of the cycle isn't as bad as it might be otherwise. And then lastly, avoid the we can measure everything syndrome. And really, when we talk about measures, I really want to get folks thinking about a couple of things. Is first of all, if you had this dial on your dashboard, what on that dial would you see that caused you concern? Is the first question. The second question is, if you had that concern, what kinds of actions might you take in response to it? If you can't respond to those kinds of questions for the measure that you're proposing, I would offer that you're probably putting in place something that's interesting, but not necessarily valuable to you as a manager of that process and its performance. Now that we've got a process designed and a way to measure it, obviously we've got to think about how we're going to go implement that process and just make it the way business gets done. And again, that's some work that requires some thinking and some planning ahead of time. A couple things we see organizations do at this stage of the game. A lot of times they rely way too heavily on the same people to implement the improvements and affect the changes. There's this core group of people, they're the high performers or whatever has caused them to be relied on, and they're valuable to have. They're certainly not somebody to exclude from the effort, but putting the onus on them entirely at this stage of the game is pretty dangerous to do. Oftentimes, you've got some time put into it at this point. You've got some thinking, and everybody's anxious, hopefully, and thinking about what the new performance is going to look like. And there's a real strong urge to just go do something at this point and initiate the actions without considering the ramifications of taking those actions. So making sure that you're putting the proper thought into what it is you're going to do and what work is required to go implement these changes, rather than just starting it on Monday. And then lastly, assuming that all the stakeholders are going to see the value on their own. A lot of folks, probably a lot of people on this call, myself included, not real anxious to go change the way I do things on a daily basis. And oftentimes when I'm asked to change, it's not entirely clear to me exactly what the value is in it for me, not to mention my organization, to do things differently. So if you are assuming that people understand why it's a good thing to make this change, you may find yourself in some difficulties later. So some of the things that we ask folks to do is don't keep that core team so small that you jeopardize the acceptance and the sustainability. If this is going to be a very cross-functional process change that affects a lot of people, then you need to get a lot of people involved. It's not just a small group of people. Otherwise, it's viewed as their initiative and not how I'm going to be doing business in the future if you haven't involved me. The implementation is hard work, and it's not simply a matter of issuing an email saying how things are going to be different on Monday and assume that people are going to do it. So understand all of the work that goes along with it, what changes about job descriptions, what kinds of capabilities need to be developed, what sort of impact does the culture that we're working in have on the change that we're affecting, what coaching and training needs to be provided on job so that people can take the new activities and tools that you're giving them and use them. Another thing that we try and avoid is a lot of folks like to go after low-hanging fruit, and there's certainly value in doing that, as long as it's not a distraction from the overall implementation. So when you see those things that can be quickly and easily fixed, is that taking away resources that are trying to meet some more strategic objectives that the BPI engagement's after, and is the value in the short term of getting that low-hanging fruit outweighing the overall strategic value of the longer-term implementation? Can't stress enough, communicate, communicate, communicate. The number of times we see an implementation kicked off with a lot of fanfare and banners hung over, shop floors and all the other things that go along with it, and that's the last that people hear. That's how you know that you're going to have a less than successful, or at least a very difficult implementation. So communication throughout, and planning for that communication at this stage of the game as to who needs to know what, and what's the messages that need to be delivered to what audiences, is critical at this stage. And at the end of the day, people want to know what's in it for them. I mean, we all work for a company and get our paycheck from them, but at the end of the day, what about this change is going to make my life better or make my headaches less than they are today? So having that message and helping people to understand why this change is necessary and beneficial is really half the battle of implementation. Up to this point now, we've got a plan for going to affect the changes. Now, it's, even though it's just one box in sort of the 8 boxes of BPI, this is where the rubber hits the road, so to speak. So implementing that future process, a couple of things we see folks doing again is they think a kickoff meeting and maybe a monthly report is enough communication to suffice for implementation. Also, implementation of a business process, especially transformational business process change, isn't necessarily a linear event. There's going to be starts and stops. There's going to be things that you thought were a great idea in the boardroom when you designed it that really just don't work in practicality when you get out to doing the tactical implementation. So understanding that there's going to be that sort of iterative nature as opposed to a straight line linear event is critical. And also, while this is going on, so is your business, and there will be current events and there will be fires that arise. Make sure you take into account what the impact of those current events is when you're considering what the impact is on the implementation of the new business process. So there may be reason to delay or to postpone the implementation based on a traumatic, significant event that occurs, but at least do that consciously, and don't get distracted by the current events when you're trying to achieve these strategic objectives. So when we look at organizations and the ones that do it well, again, that communication is critical, and it's more than just emails and status reports. Communication is coaching, communication is training, communication is management by walking around. Communication is just saying, how's it going? So there's a lot more to it than just an email or a notice posted on a billboard somewhere. There's got to be constant communication throughout this. You're literally asking people to change what they do on a daily basis, and that's just not something that people do naturally necessarily, and without needing some sort of communication throughout. At the end of the day, no matter how good the design was or how good the plan to implement it was, you were wrong. There's going to be things that come up. There's going to be things that are forgotten. There's going to be things that you thought were going to work that don't. So there's got to be that ability to manage the implementation project throughout and understand the impact of what you discover throughout that journey and what the impact is in terms of what the plan to implement looks like. Stuff happens and life goes on, and in most cases, so too should implementation. There's very few times where I've seen an event happen in an organization that made us say, you know what, we don't really want to achieve these strategic objectives of changing this business process. We should stop doing that now because of this fire that's come up. But there are those occasions where they do, and if you have to delay, at least plan to restart before disbanding. Pulling the plug on something and then not having a plan for what's this going to look like when we get back to it, there's a lot of good plans that are sitting on shelves that have never been implemented as a result of that. So if you have to delay, make sure you at least have a little bit of conversation about, so when we get back to this in X number of days, weeks, months, years, what's that going to look like? And then lastly, once you've implemented the process, once you've debugged the process, once people are sort of doing it as a matter of course, somebody's got to manage that process on an ongoing basis. So now the focus and the attention is sort of the uniqueness of the event is over, but it's still a business process that's supposed to repetitively and consistently produce results to a new standard to meet the new objectives. Where do we see organizations struggle with that is they just completely underestimate what's required in order to make sure those changes are sustained. And the number of times, you can probably think of a process change that's been put in place. There's been training, there's been a plan, there's been people attached to it, but then all of a sudden, a month later, nobody's doing it that way anymore. And then also not equipping the organization to effectively manage the process after implementation. So there are some things that you can do now as you're implementing the new process that make it much more simpler to monitor and manage that process moving forward. So things to do to avoid it is don't ignore the world that people are going to be expected to act differently in. So you're asking them to do things differently. Make sure you understand the environment that they're living in so that you can coach and communicate around that. At the end of the day, somebody needs to own the process and its performance. There's books written on process ownership, but somebody somewhere has to be responsible for whether or not that change has been put in place and is attained on a consistent basis and sustained over time. And lastly, it's difficult to manage the process on a day-to-day basis without getting tools. So if you go back to the process measurements, for example, are there some simple things I can put in place that are at least indicators of how well that process is doing, so that if I've accepted ownership of that process and its performance, I don't have to go do a 2-week investigation to find out how it's doing. I have something that is able to tell me, whether it's red, yellow, green, or some measures and metrics. Whatever those things are, put those things in place now, so that it's not as much of a chore to go find out how it's doing. Other than that, these things are easy. So there's a lot of things that can and do go wrong. There's a lot of thinking that goes into these kinds of efforts. So sort of summarize at a high level the things that we see that make successful BPI engagements work is making decisions consciously. So make sure that you're having the conversations and considering all the things you need to consider as you make these series of decisions. It's best to have a plan and some sort of a methodology. Again, we presented ours at the beginning, but anything that accomplishes those kinds of things, agree on the approach, agree on the plan, and make sure that the work is getting done and the resources are being applied correctly. Use the right individuals. Again, it's typically not a core group of 2 or 3 people. There's a lot of different ways people can be involved, whether it's subject matter expertise, whether it's project leadership, whether it's the leadership of a particular function, whether it's process ownership. There's a lot of folks that need to be involved, and how you involve them is pretty important. Be prepared. It's going to be an iterative process, and it's not easy. There's a lot of work associated, so hopefully you've balanced the benefits you're expecting to get with the amount of work it requires to get there. Communication, again, is imperative. And then at the end of the day, there's going to be issues. There's going to be things that you need to deal with during implementation, so planning for and managing those issues during the implementation in order to achieve the benefits that you're looking for is really what it's all about. That being said, I'd love to open it up if there are questions. Before we get to the questions, again, thanks again for attending. Copies of the slides and recorded version are going to be made available and sent to you. But I've got about 15, 20 minutes left of time, so I'd be happy to field any questions you might have.
Very good. Well, thank you very much for that, Brian. So I think we will open it up to questions now. I see there's a few coming in, but you should have a questions bar on, I believe it's the side of your screen. If you do have any questions, please use that to submit them to us, and I will direct them at Brian. So I think the first question that comes in, Brian, could you give us any thoughts around overcoming resistance? Particularly if you're, in terms of trying to change culture, how do you actually go about pursuing culture change?
Well, it's a good question, and if there were an easy answer, we'd all be millionaires. The bottom line is this: is when it comes to culture, you can do one of two things. You can live with the culture that you have. So, for example, if your culture is very informal, for example, so that we have a number of different kind of characteristics of cultures that we look at when we're looking at the implementation and whether the implementation is going to be difficult. Typically, we don't try as a first course to try and change the culture. We try and adapt the process and how it's implemented and how it's affected to the culture that it has to live in. So that's one approach. If you do choose to change the culture, a couple different things that we see in good organizations. One is leadership walks the walk and talks the talk. So, for example, we implemented a project management culture change in an organization not too long ago. And what we found was, they'll only listen to consultants and CI groups for so long, but it makes a difference when the CEO is the one coming out and asking, did you do a project definition? Have you done a project plan? Let me see the project plan. Have you considered resources? So he's living and walking and breathing the process change that he's asking his people to go with as well. So if there's one critical ingredient, it's making sure that it's not just something that you're doing to people, it's something you're doing with people. When you're looking at not necessarily changing the culture, but modifying the process to fit the culture that it has to live in, that's really a different ballgame. It's talking about so again, going back to the example, if you're an informal culture and you try to implement a process, that by definition is formality. So you have to be really careful as to when does strict adherence to this process is it required versus a when can I allow people, because they are by nature informal, to remain informal, and how can I manage that informality better? So again, it's asking and answering those questions. But there's no culture is if it weren't for people, this work would be really easy in most cases.
Interesting. Now, actually, I think that some of that answer actually ties into the next question, which is around effective governance, particularly with regards to finding an executive to be a project sponsor, and how you actually then communicate that sponsorship to stakeholders. Any thoughts around how you actually get that initial buy-in?
Yeah, the easiest, there's usually one question that I can ask at any client to find out who that sponsor ought to be. And so there's a question of who it ought to be, and then getting them to be are two different questions. And the one thing that I want to know is, if this performance doesn't achieve this level, who's going to get fired, or who's going to be transferred, or who's going to be on the hot seat because this performance is what it is. And that's the person, regardless of whether somebody's interested in it, but not affected by it. You need to have the people whose careers and lives and evaluations and everything else are directly affected by whether or not that process performs well. And that's where you get sponsorship. In terms of getting that sponsorship on board, really a lot of times that comes into the step of the process that we said was current state. So there is usually at the beginning of these projects, there's suspicion that there's room for improvement, or there's suspicion that there's suboptimal performance, but it's really in the current state where you're able to demonstrate quantitatively, here's exactly how much underperforming this process is compared to where it could be. So sometimes it's a matter of measuring it against best demonstrated performance, and by that we mean, if I look at the last year, were there weeks or days or shifts where the process performed better than any other time of the year, which at least tells me that I've got a realistic goal as opposed to a stretch goal. But looking for that information to be able to say, if you were able to do something about it, here's how much you're leaving on the table by not having by not going to try and close those gaps. So it's really, in most organizations, it's about getting it to a meaningful number or figure or picture in somebody's mind as to what the pain is they're really in versus what they think they might be in.
Now, I'm going to bundle two questions into one from two separate people. One is a bit of a follow-up to the very first question, which is getting a little bit more clarity around this concept of resistance. Mm-hmm. But I think it ties really well into another question that's been posed, which is, how do you get individuals and teams to accept ownership of the process?
Yep. Both good questions. I'm going to answer the second one first. The way you get them to accept the change is by involving them in developing the solution, or somebody that they trust. So, for example, if I am affecting a change to a production facility, I want operators on that team who know how the process runs, who know where the problems are. I want them coming in and being part of the solution. There is no way you're going to hire me as a consultant to tell you how to run your business better, because that content expertise has to come from within. So the more you can involve, if not them directly, somebody that they respect. So if there's somebody who's viewed as, well, if so-and-so says that's the way it should be, then I believe them because I trust them. That's the level of effort and the level of participation you need, particularly in both the current state and the future state design. So again, an external agency, whether it's an internal group or an external consultant coming in and telling you how broke you are, is powerful. But if you can get the organization to tell themselves how broken they are, it's a lot easier for them to swallow. The same thing with future state design. In terms of resistance, that's really where, I've said on 2 different slides, communicate, communicate, communicate. One of the things, you've got to start with the presumption that everybody comes to work wanting to do the right thing and wanting to do a good job. And everybody automatically can think of somebody who does not fit that profile. Those people are different. That's a different situation. But assuming that the folks understand what the change is, understand why the change is good, and there's still resistance, you've really got to look at a couple different things. One is, have I equipped them personally to be able to do it? So am I asking them to do something that's impossible? Am I giving them, are they intellectually and physically and emotionally capable of doing that? Another issue or another area sort of to look at is, do they get good feedback as to whether or not they're performing the way that we're expecting them to perform? So they may think that they're doing a good job. They're still not doing what I thought they should be doing, but I've never told them what that is. Do they get feedback as to how to correct poor performance? So it's one thing to say you didn't hit your numbers, but I've got to give them also some feedback on, and in order to hit your numbers, here's what you've got to do. And lastly, you've got to look at the situation in which they're being asked to perform. So do they have task interference that is prohibiting them from doing what they're supposed to do? Do they have conflicting or misdirected priorities? Is, yeah, I know you told me to do that change, but my boss keeps beating me over the head because I'm supposed to do this and I don't have time for your process improvement stuff over here. So there's a lot of different reasons why people may resist, and that's really where being on the floor or being involved in the process and working with folks through that implementation is critical to understanding all the different things that people are trying to accommodate as they're attempting to make this change as you're asking them to.
Now, speaking of priorities, most organizations do have quite a long list of things that need to be done. Do you have an effective way or a recommended way of prioritizing this large list of projects so that you're really identifying the ones that they best address corporate goals?
Yeah, it's got to roll from the strategy. And again, if you've got a good strategy, and strategy means different things to different people, but the way I would define strategy is do I understand what markets I'm serving? Do I understand what customers within those markets? Do I understand what products I'm offering? And do I understand strategically which markets and products I'm either entering, exiting, increasing, decreasing? That's going to generate some level of work that has some level of priority. Underneath that then is really thinking about so what business processes do I need to be good at in order to enter or exit those particular markets with those particular products? That's going to generate some work. So the strategy really ought to generate a number of strategic initiatives, all of which tie back to the strategic goals. And then the limiter then on those priorities then typically becomes the resources, because people have day jobs. So understanding, based on all the things I could do, which ones are most important to achieve these strategic objectives that I think are most important, is how I would order the list. And then the selection of which things on that list I'm going to do typically is constrained by the resources I'm able to dedicate. And sometimes most often that's people resources these days, but also sometimes that's capital investments and all the other things that are constraints on an organization. But going through that kind of consciously and rationally and making those decisions, even though there's a lot of good things you could do, you can't do them all. So making sure you're picking the ones that give you the biggest bang for the buck, that are able to be met with the resources that you have at hand is really the trick there.
Just a follow-up question to that as well. Who needs to be involved in that process of selection? Like, surely it's not just you going through individually and deciding, okay, that's the priority, that's the priority. There should be a process, I imagine, in place where you get the input from other business users.
Yes, typically when we look at business process improvement engagements, there's a steering team, there's a project team or a design team, and then there's pretty much everybody else who is engaged to some degree, but not necessarily on a formal team membership. Typically, it's a steering team, so the representation from senior leadership who agree on the strategy and the direction that they want the organization to go. They agree on where it's most important to focus the resources based on, and again, depending on to what level of comfort you need to get in terms of the data you gather, based on the inputs from all the folks that are living with the day-to-day problems and understand what's going on inside the business. But typically, the high-level priority is the selection of doing this BPI versus that BPI is done at a steering team type level, which is usually comprised of senior leadership.
Now, I think a question, it's come up a couple of times, which is the question of time, getting people to commit the time necessary. And I think as this question that's come in points out, particularly middle managers tend to be quite time poor. They're managing a lot of different objectives.
Yep.
Do you have any thought, first of all, how important is committing that time necessary? Is that one of the big pitfalls? And secondly, any thoughts on how you actually get people then to commit that time?
Yes, it is a big pitfall, and that's, if there's one thing we probably hear most often is, well, yeah, that'd be great to do, but I don't have time for it. There's a couple things you can do. The bottom line is, I'm not going to, lie here, is you are going to have more work to do if you are engaged in a BPI project than you have on your normal day-to-day basis, and that's just the nature of the beast, unfortunately. But there are some things that can be done to sort of respect sort of the sanctity of the time, because you are responsible for keeping the trains running at the same time, right? So one of the things is, that's where the point about where you use either external consultants or your own internal BI resources is, there are certain things that they can do for you that will take some of that burden off of you. So for example, in the current state assessment, I can use an external agency to document my business process, as long as they come back to me and say, here's what we saw, here's how we've seen it work, so that I understand it. But doing that physical work of actually documenting it and understanding it and gathering information can be done by a third party. And then what I'm doing is being as respectful as I can of the value of those managers' times, to be able to say, let's set a meeting. It's a 1 or 2 hour meeting. Here's the agenda. Here's the information I'm going to bring. Here's the decisions that I need you to make. Here's the guidance I'm going to be looking for from you, so that I know what you want me to do going forward. If you structure the time well, because nobody, I can't think of anybody who wants to be stuck in a meeting with 50 different people that have, maybe 5 minutes of relevance to me, and don't follow an agenda, and really don't accomplish any objectives that they were set out to accomplish. So really the structuring of how I use that time, and where and when I engage those managers, so that they're not turning leadership over to a third party, but they're using a third party to do things that are not necessary for them to do themselves, is really the key to it. But at the end of the day, you're going to have more work on your plate than you did the day before if you're engaged in the BPI, and there's just no way to get around it unless you want to turn over the reins of the company to somebody else.
Now, a question coming in here around controls and tools. How should they be created? By whom? Is it something that IT owns? Is it something owned by, say, an operational excellence group? How and who should be owning this part of the process?
At the end of it, you have to own it. Now, how it gets developed can be a couple of different ways. I'm a big fan personally of doing something manually to make sure it works mechanically. So I will, for example, do a piece of paper template that would ultimately be turned into a software application, because I want to understand the mechanics of how I'm trying to do what I'm trying to do before I tell the people who are responsible for automating it how I want the automation to work. So if you're able to get people involved in saying, well, here's sort of what I want it to look like, let me prove it out by using it for a short period of time and making sure that it works, and then engaging IT, that tends to work better than letting IT come in and say, here's the screen I'm going to design for you, and here's how you're going to use it. That's a personal bias, but I've just seen too many times where an IT solution drives what the process looks like, and that's just not always the best course. In terms of how would I use, how have we been engaged to help design things? Most consultants are happy to design something that they know is 75% correct and 25% BS. And I have no problem putting something together that I think will work for you, bringing it to you, and then we hash out the remaining 25% that I just didn't get. So can I get the 75% out of the way and not require your time to be spent on that if we all pretty much understand what that 75% ought to look like? And then when it comes down to the 25% that might be contentious, or there's a couple different ways, just focusing on that 25% is something else that I see a lot of organizations doing. There's nothing wrong with turnkey solutions, but again, the turnkey solution still needs to work inside your environment. So if you start with that end result and kind of work back to integrate it, that's a bit of a different path, but it can still work. It's just a bit of a different way of getting to the same end.
And now a very tool-specific question is, do you have any recommendations on tools to collect and document business process improvement? And that the requirement here is that it really needs to allow all stakeholders to review and understand the processes.
Yep.
With the caveat that complexity tends to lead to disinterest and inaccuracy, which I think is probably something a lot of us have experienced at one point or another.
Absolutely. I'm assuming that question is focused on the current state. Is that correct? On gathering the current state information?
I would imagine so. It doesn't
Okay.
Clarify more than that.
One of the most powerful things that I've ever seen is the most low-tech thing you've ever seen in your life is if you get a bunch of people who work in the context of a process and you put up a big piece of brown paper on the wall and give them a bunch of Post-it notes and say, describe your business process to me. That tends to produce the most robust conversations about what's broken with a business process that you can find. Alternatives to that, I mean, we don't typically get any more complex than Visio, if you're familiar with the Visio software package, to draw the flow charts. To me, the messier the better, because it's reality. When I put things into Visio, just for the sake of clarity, I tend to clean it up a bit, even though I know it's messier than I depict it. If I have Post-it notes and lines drawn all over the place and a bunch of different exception paths that nobody really thinks about, that really starts to open people's eyes up in a number of different ways. One is you present something like that to senior leadership. You inform senior leadership about their business that they had no idea about before. The number of times I've seen senior leaders say, well, I didn't know it worked that way, or I didn't know somebody was doing that, or I didn't know that's what was happening. To open up their eyes as to what's really going on is one of the values. The other thing is the people in the process who are either upstream or downstream start to get a much better understanding of the impact of their work on the other functions. So the number of times, I get something as an output of somebody else's process and I say, this is garbage, I can't use this, I don't know why they do it that way, they must be idiots. But as soon as I see the process that they used to get there and why they did it, now I understand why I get something I can't use. In addition, they now understand the impact of what they produce as an output to my process as an input, and understand why I need what I need. I'm not just asking for it to be a pain in the rear end. There are valid business reasons that the process requires, and so that communication and that understanding, again, in a big room with a big piece of paper and a bunch of Post-it notes, is about as low tech as you can get, but very, very powerful. I think the more high tech, to your point, that you get, the more you kind of obscure the issues that you really need to deal with in these kinds of initiatives.
Now, one other question, which I think ties in with this, is around the communication aspect. And I wondered if you had any thoughts on particular formats of communication. You said that, clearly it needs to be about more than just email,
Mm-hmm.
and how you actually go about defining at what stage different types of communication needs to happen along the way.
Yeah, well, the first thing we talk about is who are the different audiences. Different groups of people need to hear different things at different times and need to hear different messages quite often. So we talk a lot about that in advance. In terms of the formats and the means, it really depends on the organization and how they're used to receiving communication in the first place. Some folks, there's organizations that are kind of town hall meeting based. There are some that are very email and electronic media driven, whether it's an intranet site or whatever. In terms of the initial communications, specifically I'm talking about. But in terms of the ongoing implementation, I've found the most success has come from people just walking around and saying, "Hey, it's been a week. How's that going for you?" Or getting some of the reporting back in terms of the process performance, and going and just having a chat with somebody about, how did that go? I see you hit this number instead of this number. Just having those conversations. It's really just being interested in it. I mean, you're asking people to change how they do things, which again is a very uncomfortable situation for many, many people. And people just want to know not only what's in it for them, but that you care that that there was some change that they had to make, and asking how it's going is probably the strongest piece of communication that you can have during an implementation. Just assuming that because I told them they're going to do it, I'll reap all the benefits, really doesn't kind of energize the base of people that are typically the people responsible for making the change and producing the value.
Great thoughts there. Well, Brian, I think we're running out of time, but did you have any final thoughts overall on this topic or about any of the questions that have come in?
No, like I said, I appreciate you taking the time. Certainly, you've got my contact information there. If you have other questions or other thoughts, I'd be happy to hear from you. But thanks for joining in.
Well, thank you very much, Brian, and thanks for everyone that's participated in the webinar and asking such great questions. That is all the time we have for today's webinar, but don't forget that we do have other upcoming webinars that you can sign up for, podcasts, articles, and much more. Just log on to www.pexnetwork.com.